Good day, everyone. And today we'll be discussing the Chapter 2 Building Architecture Deciding Concept, specifically the topic of architecture. And by the way, I am Kir Ivan J. Kababat, a third year BSc student of Ramon Magsaysay Memorial Colleges. Now, let's define architecture, the art and technique of a designing and building as distinguished from skills associated with construction. The practice of architecture is employed to fulfill both practical and expressive requirements, and thus it serves both utilitarian and aesthetic ends. Although these two ends may be distinguished, they cannot be separated, and the relative weight given to each can vary widely because every society, whether highly developed or less so, settled or nomadic, has a spatial relationship to the natural world and to other societies. The structures they produce reveal much about their environment, including the climate and weather, history, ceremonies, and artistic sensibility, as well as many aspects of our daily life. So there are characteristics that distinguish a work of architectures from, and here it is. Number one, the suitability of the work to use by human beings in general and adaptability of it to particular human activities. The number two is the stability and permanence of the work's construction and the communication of experience and ideas through its form. All these conditions must be met in architecture. The second is a constant, while the first and third may vary in relative importance according to the social functions of the buildings, such as if the function is chiefly utilitarian, as in a factory, communication is of less importance. If the function is chiefly expressive, as in a monumental tomb, utility is a minor concern. In some buildings, such as churches and city halls, utility and communication may be of equal importance. And different structures requires different prioritizations. So, in theory of architecture, the term theory of architecture was originally simply the accepted translation of the Latin term ratiocinatio, as used by Vitruvius, a Roman architect engineer of the 1st century CE, to differentiate intellectual to practical knowledge in architectural education, but it has come to signify the total basis for judging the merits of buildings or building projects, such as reasoned judgment are as essential part of the architectural creative process. A building can be designed only by a continuous creative intellectual dialogue between imagination and reason in the mind of each creator. A variety of interpretations has been given to the term architectural theory by those who have written or spoken on the topic in the past. Before 1750, every spoken treatise or published lecture course on architecture could appropriately be described as a textbook on architectural theory. But after the changes associated with the Industrial Revolution, the amount of architectural knowledge that could be acquired only by academic study increased to the point where a complete synthesis became virtually impossible in a single volume. So, theory of architecture continuation. The historical evolution of architectural theory is accessibly mainly from manuscripts, published treatises, from critical essays, commentaries, and from surviving buildings of every epoch. It is in no way a type of historical study that can reflect accurately the spirit of age, and in this respect is similar to history of philosophy itself. Some were architectural treatises, were intended to publicize novel rather than to state widely accepted ideas. The most idiosyncratic theories could have, and often did, exert wide and sometimes beneficial influence. But the value of this influence is not necessarily related to the extent of this acceptance. even when buildings constructed before 1500 remain intact, and many textbooks dealing with the antique and medieval theories of architecture seldom make qualitative distinctions and generally imply that all surviving antiques and medieval buildings are good, if not absolutely perfect. Nevertheless, the study of history of architectural philosophy, like that of the theory or of the history of general philosophy, not only teaches us what past generations taught, but can help individuals decide how to do themselves and should act and judge. For those desirous of establishing a viable theory of architecture for their own era, it is generally agreed that great stimulus can be found in studying historical evidence and speculating on the ideals achievements of those who created this evidence. So, theory of architecture may not just be a history but also contains knowledge and a basis for us to create a more uh, complex structure or more expressive, and the way that it contains our new era ideals of creating a building. So, distinction between history and theory of architecture. So, there are distinction. The distinction between the history and theory of architecture did not emerge until the mid 18th century. Indeed, the establishment of two separate academic disciplines was not even nominal until 1818, when separate professorships with these titles were established at the École des Beaux Arts in Paris. Even then, however, the distinction was seldom scrupulously maintained by either specialist. It is impossible to discuss meaningfully but the building of immediate past without discussing the ideals of those who built them, just as it is impossible to discuss the ideals of bygone architects without references to the structures they designed. Nevertheless, since any two disciplines that are inseparable complementary can at the same time be logical distinguishes, well, it may be asserted that this particular distinction first became manifest in Les Roins des Place Beaux Monument de la Crise. In English, the ruins of the most beautiful monuments of Greece. Written in 1758 by a French architecture student named namely Julien David Leroy. Faced with the problem of discussing the Athenian buildings constructed in the time of Vitruvius, he decided to discuss them twice by treating them separately under two different headings. Before this date, history was of architectural importance only a means of justifying by reference to classical mythology. The use of what it decided okay, defended the state history, mythology, classical. He reference to classical mythology. The use of certain otherwise rational elements such as caryatids, even a Jacques Francois Blondel, who in 1750 was probably the first architectural student to devote a separate section of his lecture course to history, envisaged the subject mainly as an account of the literal references to architecture found in antique manuscripts. An attitude was already developed. Renaissance architect Leon Battista Alberti. So this is the face or how it looks like the École des Beaux Arts in Paris. And in Athens, sorry, Erectium Caryatid, porch of the Erectium on the Acropolis at Athens. So this is the place that we're talking just a little while ago. This one, highlighted one. Next is the modern concept of architectural history was in fact simply part of a larger trend stimulated by the leading writers of the French Enlightenment at an 18th century intellectual movement that developed from interrelated conceptions of reason, nature, and the man. As a result of discussing constitutional law in terms of its evolution, every branch of knowledge, especially the natural social sciences, was eventually seen as a historical sequence. In the philosophy of architecture, as in all other kinds of philosophy, the introduction of historical method not only facilitated the teaching of this subject but also militated against the elaboration of theoretical speculations. So, just as those charged with responsibility of lecturing on ethics found it very much easier to lecture on the history of ethics rather than to discuss how a person should or should not act in a specific contemporary circumstances. So, those who lectured on architectural theory found it easier to recite detailed accounts of what had been done in the past rather than to recommend practical methods of dealing with current problems. So, just how they're thinking on that time. Moreover, the system of the Paris École des Arts, which provided virtually the only organized system of architectural education at the beginning of the 19th century, was radically different from that of the Free Revolutionary Académie Royale d'Architecture, Quatremaire de Quincy, an Italophile archaeologist who had been trained as a sculptor united the school of architecture with that of a painting and a sculpture to form a single organization so that, although architecture students were ultimately given their own professors of theory, the whole theoretical background of their studies was assimilated to the other two fine arts by lecture courses and textbooks such as one of it is the Hippolytines Philosophie d'Art. Charles Blanc, Grammaire des Arts du Design, and Eugene Golamas, Essai sur la théorie du dessin. So, pardon me if I pronounce it wrong. For further correct pronunciation, you can Google it. So similarly, whereas before 1750, the uniformity of doctrines, the basic premises of which were ostensibly unchanged since the Renaissance, allowed the professor of architecture to discuss antique and buildings as example of architectural theory, and to ignore medieval buildings completely. The mid-19th century controversy between medievalists and classicists, the Battle of the Styles, and ensuing faith in eclecticism turned the studies of architectural history into courses on archaeology. Thus, the attitude of those scholars who, during the 19th century and early 20th century, wished to expound a theory of architecture that was neither a philosophy or of art nor a history of architecture, tended to become highly personal, if not idiosyncratic. By 1950, theoretical writings concentrated almost easily on vital aspects of architecture, thereby identifying that the theory of architecture with what before 1750 would have been regarded as simply that aspects that Vitruvius called Venostas, example beauty. This approach did not necessarily invalidate the conclusion reached, but many valuable ideas then put forward as theories of architecture were only partial theories in which it was taken for granted that theoretical concepts concerning construction and planning were dealt with in other contexts. Before embarking on any discussions as to the nature of the philosophy of architecture, it is essential to distinguish that between two mutually exclusive theories that affects the whole course of any such speculation. The first theory regards the philosophy of architecture as the applications of a general philosophy of art to a particular type of art. And the second, on the contrary, regards to the philosophy of architecture as per its study, through it may well many characteristics common to theories of other arts, it is generally distinct. So, On the distinction between the theory of architecture and theory of art continuation, the first notion that there exists is a generic theory of art, which theory of architecture as a specific extension has been widely held since the mid-century, when the artist and writer Giorgio Vasari published in his Le Vitae de più eccellenti pittori, scultori ed architettori italiani, the lives of the most eminent Italian painters, sculptors, and architects. So in his publish, it inputs the greatest lives of names of Italian painters, sculptors, and architects. His assertion that painting, sculpture, and architecture are all of common ancestry, creating a harmony in his painting that it connects that painter and sculptures and architects are one, or in one ancestry, one origin. So the ability to draw, this idea became a particularly prevalent among English-speaking theorists, since the word design is used to translate both diseño, a drawing, and conceito, a mental plan. But its main influence was on Western thought was due to Italophile Frenchmen after Louis XIV had been induced to establish in Rome French Academy modeled on Italian art academies. So next is, as a result of those uh, situations, the widespread of influence of French culture in the 7th and 18th centuries and the concept of beauty arts, literally beautiful arts but usually translated into English as fine arts, was accepted by Anglo-Saxon theorists as denoting a philosophical entity to the point where it was generally forgotten that in France itself, the architecture professions remained totally aloof from the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture until they were forced to amalgamate after the French Revolution. So, this theory of fine arts, it might not have been widely adopted but for the development of aesthetics elaborated after 1750, thus when academies of fine arts were being established successfully and successively in Denmark, Russia, and England on the model of French Academy in Rome. German philosophers were gradually asserting that it was possible to elaborate a theory of beauty without the reference to function Zweig. That in any theory of beauty should applicable to all sensory perceptions, whether visual, auditory, and that the notion of beauty was not only aspect of a much larger concept of life enhancing sensory stimuli. So, the alternative theory that a philosophy of architecture is a unique can be therefore be evolved only to be specific reference to the art of building will be dealt with below with reference to the traditional triad usually cited in the formula coined by the English theorist Sir Henry Wotton. In his book, The Elements of Architecture, namely the commodity, firmness, and delight. Generally speaking, wait, sorry. Generally speaking, writers on aesthetics have been noticeably reluctant to use architecture examples in support of speculations as to the nature of their general theories, but reference to building have been used in most philosophies of art. Ever since the German philosophers Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel first popularized the philosophical discipline, Kant, in his Critique der Urteilskraft, distinguished between what he termed free beauty, pulchritudo vaga, and dependent beauty, pulchritudo adhaerens. He classified architecture as dependent beauty and saying that in a thing that is possible only by means of design, abstract, a building, or even an animal. The regularity of consisting is symmetry must express the unity of intuition that accompanies the concept of purpose. Right? And this regularity belongs to cognition. Nevertheless, let's move down our camera because it's hinder us to read. Let's back it up. So, nevertheless, he claimed that a flower should be classified as a free beauty, beware the judgment of taste is pure, and because hardly anyone could have botanist knows what sort of thing a flower ought to be. And even he thought recognizing in the flower reproductive organ of the plant pays no regard on this natural purpose if he has passing judgment on flower by taste. What Kant's reaction would have been to a modern plastic imitation of flower is impossible to guess, but it readily perceived why those who in the 19th century accepted the notion that beauty in architecture, pulchritudo adherence, felt as antipathy towards shams. How the distance between pure art and functional art became confused, and why there arose tendency to pursue definitions of pure art or pure beauty without specifically referring to the functions and structures of any particular class of a beautiful artistic object such as buildings. Now we can't imagine how Kant's what will be thinking of today's modernizations of buildings, and just like the flower from original, he perceived it on a different class. Now there's a producing of a plastic flower, which is a different class also. I don't know how Kant will classify this. This latter tendency was reinforced when the French philosopher Victor Cousin, writing in 1835, classified the history of philosophy under the three distinct headings: the true, the beautiful, and the good. The ensuing acceptance of the idea that beauty was to be studied independently of truth, goodness produced a tendency to not merely to regard beauty as something added to a building, rather than conceptually inseparable from the truth and goodness of its structure and function, but to regard beauty as limited to visual emotional qualities. So it satisfies that beauty can be seen as it satisfies our visuals and also our emotional qualities when we see something that is so beautiful. So that's how French philosopher Victor Cousin in his theory discuss it. So in the first half of 20th century, philosopher grew less dogmatic about aesthetics, but its influence on theories of architecture became stronger because of the popular view that sculpture was essentially non-representational. Thus, although the assertion that aesthetically architecture is the creation of sculpture big enough to walk about inside was meaningful in the 20th century, it would have seemed nonsensical to any architectural theorist living before 19th century. But when sculpture was invariably thought of either as a representational or as a carved refinement of load-bearing wood or stone, architecture is created only to fulfill the specification of an individual or group. So, economic law prevents architects from emulating their fellow artists in producing works for which demand is non-existent or only potential. So the type of architecture depends upon social formations that may be classified according to the role of the patron in the community. The types are discussed here, such as domestic, religious, governmental, recreational, welfare and educational. Commercial and industrial represents the simplest classification. A scientific typology of architecture would require a more detailed analysis. So there are different types existing that may differ on its usage and also in priority. So First is the domestic architecture. Let's discuss it. So, domestic architecture is produced for the social unit, the individual family or clan, their dependents, human and animal. It provides shelter, security, for the basic physical functions of life, at times also for commercial, industrial, architect, agricultural activities that involve the family unit rather than that of the community. So it just belongs to the family. It just circles around the family. Okay. Uh, and the basic requirements of the domestic architectures is simple. A place to be sleep, prepare food, eat, and perhaps work. A place that has some light and is protected from the weather. A single room with sturdy walls and roof. A door, a window, and a heart that are necessities. All else, if above these conditions, is a luxury. So next is the vernacular architecture. In much of the world today, even where institutions have been a continuous process of change, dwelling types of ancient prehistoric origin are in use in the industrial unit states. For instance, barns are being built according to a design employed in Europe in the first millennium BCE. The forces that produce a dynamic evolution of architectural style and communal buildings are usually inactive in the home and farm. The lives of average people may be altered by the most fundamental change in their institution. The people can be successively slaves, the subjects of monarchy, and voting citizens without having the means to desire change their customs, techniques, or surroundings. So, e- economic pressure is the major factor that causes average individuals to restrict their demands to a level far below that which the technology of their time is capable of maintaining. Frequently, they build new structures with old techniques because experiment and innovation are more costly than repetitions. But in wealthy cultures, economy permits the customs encourage architects to provide convenience such as sanitation, lighting, and heating, as well as separate areas for distinction functions. This may become regarded as necessities. The same causes tend to replace the conservatism of the home with the aspirations of institutional architecture and to emphasize the expressive as well as utilitarian function. So one of the example of it is the igloo in Greenland and Canada, but in modern countries or countries that are more wealthy, I mean this is the Greenland and Canada maybe before, because in some parts of this place, there are now igloos that are more advanced. They have a new innovations, creating a new type of igloo. But this is one of the examples where low economy or they are having economic pressures where they just use the old techniques and creating this igloo. This is just only example of vernacular architecture. Next is power architecture. As wealth and expressive functions increase, a special type of domestic building can be distinguished that may be called a power architecture. In almost every civilization, the pattern of a society gives to a few of its members the power to utilize resources of the community in the constructions of their homes, places, villas, gardens, places of recreations. These views advantages usually rise from economic, religious, or class distinctions. They are able to enjoy an infinite variety of domestic activities connected with the more of their positions. Example of these are the presidents, uh, the pope. They have some distinctions of their buildings. So this can include even communal functions. The places of Flavian emperors in ancient Rome incorporated the activities of the state and the judicial system. The places of Versailles, a whole city in itself, provides necessities and luxuries of life for several thousands of persons of all classes and was center of the government for the empire of Louis the XIV. So What I mentioned is just only a few. And next is still the power of architecture. It has a complex expressive function too, since symbolizing of power by elegance or display is a responsibility or necessity and often at fault of the powerful. So to display their power, some some people or some with high class, they put more expressive functions on their power architecture. Since this function usually is sought not so much to delight the patrons as to demonstrate their social positions to others. Power's architecture becomes communal as well as domestic, and democracies such as in ancient Greece and in the modern Western world. This show of power may have been more reserved but is still distinguishable. One of its example is the Palace of Versailles, which is situated on France. And this picture below is what it looks like. Next. So, on the third type is the housing. Domestic architecture accommodates group of rather than the unit and is therefore public as well as private. It is familiar through the widespread development of mass housing in the modern world. So, in which the individuals or families find living space either in multiple dwellings or in single units produced in quantity. Group housing is produced by the many kinds of culture by communal states to equalize living standards by tyrants, to assure a docile labor force, and by feudal lords or castle systems to bring together members of a class. And the apartment house was developed independently by the imperial Romans of antiquity to suit urban conditions and by Americans Indians to suit agricultural conditions. One of the examples is Les Needs, Corbevoie, is stated in France. So there are more examples of group housing, but I just put one example for just display. So more of group housing is may also be a power architecture as well as particularly when land values are too high or to permit even the wealthy to build privately as in 17th century plus Place des Vosges in Paris, where aristocratic mansions were designed uniformly around a square, or in the 18th century, flats in English towns spas. Although most domestic architecture of 21st century employed the style and technique of the past, the exceptions and the more numerous and more important for the development of architecture than ever. This is because the distribution of wealth and power is widespread in parts of the world where architecture is vital and because modern state has assumed responsibility for much high and quality housing. So, thank you for listening.